Feeling abandoned? Listen to this story. Jack was a strong, sturdy horse living on a small, modest farm at the edge of a remote village. His days were consumed with pulling heavy loads and ploughing rough fields from dawn until dusk, his hooves worn down and muscles aching by the end of each long day. The farmer, a quiet man known more for his hard work than for his words, rarely acknowledged Jack beyond occasional gruff commands. It was clear to Jack that he was considered nothing more than a means to an end, a powerful workhorse whose value was measured by his labor. The farm itself was simple, just a patch of land scattered with crops and an old barn where Jack and a few other animals slept. Jack had his corner in the barn, a small cold place where the straw was thin and the draught seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Though he was a hard-working and loyal horse, Jack felt deeply isolated, like a forgotten piece in the farmer's world. Even the other animals were distant, each occupied with their own tasks or interests. They hardly looked his way as they went about their days, leaving Jack alone in his labor and thoughts. Despite his resilience, Jack couldn't ignore the empty feeling that weighed down his heart. He longed for companionship, for a word or gesture that showed he was seen and valued. Every day, as he dragged the plow across the fields or hauled heavy loads of firewood, he would gaze out toward the horizon, wondering if there might be something more out there, something he couldn't name, but desperately wanted. The sky, wide and endless, seemed to mock his wishes, as if to say, "You're just a horse, Jack. Your life is here, tied to the yoke and the plow." As days blended into weeks, Jack's isolation felt heavier. Though he was strong on the outside, something within him began to crack, creating a hidden vulnerability that grew deeper with every silent sunrise and sunset. He felt like a single leaf drifting through a world that would carry on unchanged with or without him. Though he tried to accept his fate, there was a quiet voice within him, a longing that whispered, "There has to be more than this." Jack's longing grew stronger with each passing day, a quiet ache that pulsed alongside his steady heartbeat. He continued his work, pulling loads and obeying the commands of the farmer, yet felt that life was slipping away, as if he were trapped in an endless loop. Even when he lay down at night, surrounded by the sounds of the farm's other animals rustling and snoring in their stalls, the quiet felt too loud, filled with questions he couldn't answer. Why was he here? What was the point of all this work if he was nothing more than a tool to his owner? The farm held no answers. The other animals seemed satisfied with their simple lives, accepting their places with little thought to purpose or connection. The old goat who lived nearby would often pass by with a nod, never lingering, his world focused on grazing. The chickens were busy scratching at the dirt, their heads bobbing mindlessly as they clucked and picked through grains. And the sheep were rarely even visible, grazing at a distance and keeping to themselves, content within their flock. Jack's mind, however, wasn't content. He found himself feeling resentful as he watched the farmer give the other animals at least a bit of attention, even if just a pat on the head or a few kind words. Jack's own contribution to the farm was greater than any of theirs. He worked tirelessly to pull, lift, and plow, yet he received nothing in return. No thanks, no kindness. The days began to feel heavier, as if a cloud of loneliness had settled permanently over him. At the end of another long, grueling day, Jack stood alone in his stall, feeling utterly depleted. His body was strong, but his spirit felt like a crumbling wall, each stone worn down by the harsh wind of isolation. As the evening sky faded to a dusky purple, he found himself thinking that perhaps he'd been wrong to hope for something more. Perhaps he was just meant to live like this, a silent, solitary life filled only with endless work. Yet, beneath this sense of resignation, a spark remained, a flicker of hope that something somehow could change. Jack didn't know what he was hoping for, or even if he truly believed in it anymore, but he clung to that tiny glimmer. He sensed deep within that his story wasn't finished yet, and though he couldn't yet imagine how, he felt the faintest inkling that life held something more for him, if only he could find it. One hot afternoon, Jack was harnessed to the heaviest load he had ever been tasked with, an enormous wooden cart piled high with sacks of grain and heavy farm tools. The sun beat down fiercely, and the rough ground made each step harder. Jack strained against the yoke, his muscles rippling under his sleek brown coat, but the weight seemed impossible. Every inch felt like a mountain, and with each pull, his heart pounded harder as exhaustion crept into his bones. The farmer, impatient to get the load moved, shouted harsh commands and slapped the reins, urging Jack to keep going faster. Sweat began to soak Jack's coat, dripping from his brow and leaving trails down his sides as he pushed himself forward. His hooves kicked up clouds of dust, stinging his eyes, but he dared not slow down. He knew what came if he did. In his mind, he pleaded for strength, wishing that just this once someone would offer him a word of encouragement instead of relentless demands. But the load was simply too much. As Jack struggled to climb a small incline, his left hoof caught on a rock embedded in the dirt, and suddenly a sharp pain shot through his leg. He tried to steady himself, but the cart's weight pressed down, and Jack's injured leg gave out. He collapsed, the cart tilting sideways and spilling part of its load onto the ground. The pain in his leg was piercing, and he lay still, feeling a surge of panic as the farmer's angry voice rang out. Instead of compassion or concern, the farmer's words were cold and cutting. "Useless creature," he yelled, walking over to Jack and glaring down at him. "I don't need a horse that can't pull his weight." With a frustrated huff, he pulled the remaining items from the cart and began to gather the spilled tools and sacks of grain, muttering angrily to himself all the while. He left Jack lying there in the dirt, his leg throbbing, feeling discarded like nothing more than broken equipment. As the farmer walked away, Jack watched him go with a mix of disbelief and sadness. The stinging pain in his leg seemed to pale in comparison to the ache in his heart. He had given his best every single day, asking for nothing in return, and yet, when he needed help, he was abandoned. Slowly, he lifted his head, looking out over the empty field. In that lonely moment, Jack felt as if he were looking into the face of his own reality, and it was a cruel, unkind face indeed. For the first time, Jack felt the weight of despair settle heavily on his heart. If he couldn't fulfill his purpose, what was left for him? The dreams of a life with meaning and companionship seemed like distant illusions now, flickering like mirages on the hot, dusty horizon. He closed his eyes, defeated, wondering if he'd ever rise again, not just from the ground, but from the loneliness that had now seeped into every corner of his soul. As night fell, Jack lay alone in the field, his injured leg throbbing and his spirit crushed. The stars above seemed distant and indifferent, blinking down on him as if to emphasize the vastness of the world and his small, solitary place in it. He shifted painfully, trying to find a position that eased the ache, but there was no comfort to be found. The silence around him grew heavy, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. His body was sore, but his heart felt even more wounded, as if all the loneliness he had carried for years had now settled deeply within him. In the quiet, Jack's thoughts turned inward, moving from the pain in his leg to the emptiness he felt in his soul. The image of the farmer's cold gaze replayed in his mind, reminding him of how little he mattered to anyone. It hurt to know that his loyalty, his hard work, and his quiet endurance had gone unnoticed. A sadness he could no longer ignore crept over him, and for the first time, Jack allowed himself to feel it fully. All the years he'd spent hoping for a word of kindness, a moment of warmth, they felt wasted now, like dried leaves blown away by the wind. The thought struck him that perhaps he had been foolish to ever hope for more. In the world he knew, kindness seemed like a luxury, reserved for others, but never for him. He had been a tool, a means to an end, nothing more. And here he was, discarded in the field like broken equipment, left to face the night alone. As he stared into the darkness, Jack felt the sharp sting of realization. He was alone, truly alone, in a way he had never acknowledged until now. A shiver ran through him, though the air was still warm. The weight of isolation pressed down on him, filling him with a sense of abandonment so deep that it felt like he was drowning in it. His heart, once strong and hopeful, felt hollow, as though all the longing and loneliness had hollowed out a part of him. The field around him was empty, stretching out in all directions, and he saw no way out, no light at the end of his dark thoughts. Jack closed his eyes, feeling that perhaps this was all he could expect from life. A silent, solitary existence, punctuated only by work and weariness. But as his eyes closed and his thoughts grew quiet, he noticed something new, a faint warmth, a gentle stirring in his heart. It was faint, barely there, but it caught his attention. Amid the darkness within him, he felt a whisper of something he couldn't name, a quiet presence that somehow, despite everything, filled him with a glimmer of hope. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't know what it meant, but he knew that this small spark, however faint, was all he had left. Just as Jack felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a soft rustling sound broke through the quiet night. He lifted his head cautiously, his ears pricking forward as he strained to see in the darkness. Out of the shadows, a small figure emerged, a barn owl, its white feathers shimmering softly under the moonlight. The owl landed gracefully beside him, her large, wise eyes meeting his. There was a kindness in her gaze that Jack hadn't seen in a very long time. "Jack," she said in a voice both gentle and knowing, "I see you've been carrying a heavy burden on your heart, far heavier than any load you pulled during the day." Jack blinked, taken aback that anyone would notice, let alone care. But he was too tired to pretend otherwise, so he nodded slowly. "I've tried to be strong," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've done my best every day, worked as hard as I could, but it's never been enough. I feel forgotten, like no one would care if I disappeared." The owl listened with patient empathy, her head tilted slightly as she considered his words. "It's not weakness to feel sadness, Jack, and it's not foolish to hope for kindness. But sometimes the path to peace is one we must find within ourselves." Jack's brow furrowed. He couldn't imagine how he could find peace alone. "How could I do that?" he asked. "I've tried so hard, but no one cares. I've been left here in the middle of this field, like I don't even matter." The owl's eyes softened as she leaned a little closer. "It's true you've been overlooked, and that pain is real. But there is a way to change how you feel, even when the world around you stays the same." She paused, then continued gently. "Have you ever tried gratitude, Jack?" "Gratitude?" Jack repeated, his voice a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He had heard the word before, but he'd never thought of it as something that could help him. "Yes, gratitude," she said, her tone unwavering. "Not as something you say when things are going well, but as something you practice even when things feel their darkest. Thankfulness is not only for what you have, but for each moment you live, each breath you take. When you choose gratitude, you change your heart, and sometimes the world around you begins to change as well." Jack was quiet, taking in her words. The idea seemed impossible. How could gratitude help him now, when he felt so low, so invisible? But the way the owl spoke, with a conviction that went deeper than words, filled him with a cautious hope. "I don't know if I can," he said, hesitating, "but if it's true, if this gratitude can really help me find peace, I'm willing to try." The owl nodded approvingly, a soft glimmer of light flashing in her wise eyes. "It may feel strange at first," she said, "but with each breath, think of something, however small, that brings you comfort, even if it's just the moonlight on the field or the whisper of the breeze. Start there, and in time you may find the burdens of your heart beginning to lift. Jack nodded, a sense of resolve forming in him. Perhaps it was a small step, but it was one he could take. He closed his eyes, feeling the gentle wind on his face, the coolness of the earth beneath him. Quietly, he whispered his first words of gratitude, feeling a warmth in his heart he hadn't felt before. In the days that followed, Jack began to practice the gratitude the owl had spoken of. Each morning, as the sun rose over the horizon and bathed the fields in warm light, he would pause, close his eyes, and whisper his thanks for one small thing. Sometimes it was the feeling of the sun's warmth on his coat or the taste of fresh water after a long day's work. Other times, it was the sight of a distant bird flying freely across the sky, reminding him of the beauty that still existed in his world. At first, it felt strange. Gratitude was something he'd never truly experienced before, and it was difficult to find things to appreciate when his life felt so barren. But as the days passed, he noticed a subtle shift in himself. The heavy sadness he'd carried in his heart began to feel a bit lighter, his spirit a bit stronger. He found that the simple act of noticing something good, however small, brought him a sense of peace that made the hardships of his day more bearable. Gradually, Jack's days took on a new rhythm. With each morning, he found something new to be grateful for. He began to feel a quiet joy in the routine that once felt so hollow. And even though his work remained the same, the burdens of his heart seemed less overwhelming. He found himself feeling more connected to the world around him, noticing the way the wind rustled the leaves on the old oak tree by the barn, or the way the shadows stretched across the field as the sun set each evening. One afternoon, as he pulled a lighter load across the field, he noticed the farmer watching him from a distance. His usual stern gaze softened. Jack wasn't sure why, but he felt a flicker of warmth in his heart, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his shift in perspective was changing more than just his own spirit. Then something unexpected happened. The other animals on the farm began to approach him, drawn to his calm and gentle presence. The chickens would gather around as he rested, clucking softly in friendly chatter. The sheep grazed a little closer to him, sometimes lying down nearby as they chewed their cud in peace. Even the old goat, who had always kept his distance, came near, his sharp eyes glancing at Jack with a look of respect. For the first time, Jack felt a sense of belonging that went beyond his duties on the farm. His gratitude, once a small spark, had grown into a warmth that seemed to draw others near. His days, though filled with work, no longer felt empty. Each moment became a part of a new rhythm, one that was gentler, richer, and more meaningful. And with every thankful thought, Jack felt his heart opening a little more, as if the loneliness he once knew had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, lasting peace. He was no longer just a workhorse bound to his duties. He was Jack, a creature who had found a way to carry his burdens lightly, with a heart filled with gratitude. Jack's heart continued to grow lighter with each passing day, his gratitude deepening with every quiet moment. The change within him had become evident to everyone on the farm, and even the farmer began to see Jack with new eyes. One morning, as Jack stood quietly by the fence, the farmer approached him slowly. His usual brisk pace softened. For the first time, he reached out, giving Jack a gentle pat on the neck. "Good boy, Jack," he murmured, a rare warmth in his voice. Jack felt a deep sense of peace and acceptance as he stood there, realizing that his journey had come full circle, not because of a grand change in his surroundings, but because of the change within himself. His days were the same, yet everything felt different. Each task, each breath, had become part of a rhythm of peace he could finally embrace. Over time, Jack's story spread quietly across the farm. Other animals approached him for comfort, drawn by his calm spirit and kind gaze. They listened to his story of loneliness, of longing, and how gratitude had transformed his life. The barn owl visited him occasionally, her wise eyes watching as he shared his journey with those who needed it most. "Thank you for showing me the way," he would say to her, grateful for her guidance that night under the stars. As the seasons changed, Jack's corner of the farm transformed too. Where once his stall had been bare and cold, it was now a place of warmth, filled with the gentle presence of friends. The loneliness that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a deep, lasting joy. Jack had found his purpose, and it was not in the work he did, but in the peace he carried within him, a peace that radiated out to those around him. The farm animals would often gather in the evenings, sharing their own tales of gratitude and joy. Jack's journey had shown them that even in the hardest of times, there was always something to be thankful for, and as they listened to his story, they too learned to see the world through grateful eyes, finding peace in their own hearts. Jack's legacy grew beyond the boundaries of the farm, carried on by the animals who visited, and even by the farmer who had begun to see his work in a new light. Jack had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in resisting life's hardships, but in accepting them with a grateful heart. In the end, Jack had discovered a truth as wide as the horizon he once longed to reach. Gratitude had not only changed his life, it had created a ripple of kindness that spread far beyond him. He had found a home within himself, a home he carried with him each day, in every step and every breath. Jack had transformed his life with gratitude, and through his story, he had touched the lives of many. If you enjoyed Jack's journey, consider sharing his story of resilience and gratitude. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of wisdom and hope, and remember, sometimes the greatest changes come from within. Thank you for being a part of this journey.